At 7:55, you hear airplane sounds in the sky and think it's morning drill. A few seconds later, the first bomb explodes. Ships are burning, and you're right in the middle of a life-or-death battle. This isn't a drill. This is the Pearl Harbor attack. The morning thousands of Americans will lose their lives. So, what would you have done if you had been born there? Before we begin the video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which country you're watching from. So today, let's go to the story of an ordinary soldier at Pearl Harbor that no one has ever told. Chapter 1. Duty in Paradise Island. As November 1940, one's cold winds enveloped San Francisco Harbor, you stood on the deck of a giant transport ship, looking at the assignment paper in your hand. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This name sounded like a dream because everyone said Hawaii was paradise with its palm trees, clear beaches, and warm sun. However, you weren't going on vacation. You were going to a military base that was the heart of the Pacific Fleet, and you couldn't fully grasp what this assignment meant. As the ship left the harbor, you looked one last time at the continent you were leaving behind, and brought before your eyes that moment when your family waved to you. Your mother was trying to hide her tears. Your father was trying to appear stern, but you had noticed the worry in his voice. Your little sibling had asked, "When will you come back?" And you had said, "Very soon," though deep down you didn't know how long this would last. After a 10-day journey, when Hawaii's shores appeared on the horizon, the first view you saw was truly breathtaking. While green volcanic mountains rose toward the clouds, palm trees wrapping the coastline swayed gently in the tropical wind. The ocean was so clear you could even see the coral reefs beneath the ship, and the colors were so vivid you felt like you had come here for vacation, not war. But as you approached Pearl Harbor, its true face began to emerge. Giant warships lined up in the harbor, fighter planes patrolling the sky, and soldiers rushing on the dock reminded you this wasn't an ordinary paradise island. This was the center of America's greatest military power in the Pacific, and you were now part of that power. When you stepped on land, Hawaii's heat immediately enveloped you, because even November here was like a summer day, and this heat was very different from San Francisco's cold mornings. In the truck, taking you and other new arrivals to the barracks on Ford Island, while looking out the window, you saw Honolulu's colorful streets, locals' clothing, and exotic flower scents spreading everywhere. However, when the truck entered the military zone, the atmosphere completely changed. Concrete buildings, strict security checks, constant whistle sounds and commands. This wasn't paradise. You were inside a machine preparing for war, and you were now one of the gears in that machine. In the first days, you were assigned to USS Oklahoma, and when you first boarded this giant warship, you were amazed by its size. A Nevada-class battleship, Oklahoma was 175 meters long and weighed 35,000 tons, making it a floating fortress. Walking on deck, you got lost in the labyrinth of giant cannons, complex engine rooms, and endless corridors. Your duty was to work in the ship's ammunition section, and this meant carrying, storing, and distributing shells for the heavy cannons when necessary. The work was physically demanding because each shell weighed hundreds of kilograms, and carrying these enormous metals all day tired your back and arms. But over time, your body got used to this work, and working with your friends made the job more bearable. Life on the ship flowed in strict discipline because every morning at 6 o'clock the reveille whistle blew, and whether sleepy or tired, you immediately jumped up and got down from your bunk. You had only 15 minutes to wash your face, put on your uniform, and get on deck. And then morning muster began. Every morning, the commander with the same serious expression reviewed the soldiers lined up on the ship's deck. and checked whether there were any deficiencies or irregularities. After muster, breakfast began, and in the ship's mess hall, hot coffee, eggs, bread, and sometimes ham were served. The meals weren't delicious, but they satisfied your hunger, and, while chatting with your friends, you discussed how the day would go. After breakfast, daily duties began, and these generally included ship maintenance work, drills, or training. Some days you learned how to use the cannons. Some days you did fire drill exercises. Some days you just cleaned different parts of the ship. Afternoons were usually free time, and you spent these hours sitting on deck writing letters. Reading the letters your mother sent every week made you feel close to home, and the lines where she talked about her life, the neighborhood, your little sibling's school opened the door to another world for you. You also told her about Hawaii's beauties, life on the ship, and your friends, but you never mentioned the possibility of war because you didn't want to worry her. The friendships you made on the ship had become one of the most valuable parts of your life, because with these people you weren't just working, you were sharing your life. Tommy, who slept in the bunk next to you, was a chatty kid from Brooklyn and constantly talked about his family, his girlfriend, and what he'd do when he got home. Rodriguez, on duty one floor below, was a quiet and deep person, came from Texas, and always played guitar in his spare time. Some evenings you gathered on deck and listened to the songs he played, and sometimes you all sang together. These moments reminded you that beyond war, discipline, and fatigue, you were still human. Saturday nights you were usually on leave, and during these times you left the ship and flocked to Honolulu's streets. The city was overflowing with military personnel because thousands of soldiers and sailors wanted to rest, have fun, and remember real life at the same time. You and your friends usually went to bars on Hotel Street, had a beer, listened to music, and sometimes watched dancing girls. Tommy tried to meet a local girl every time and got rejected every time, but this never discouraged him. Rodriguez would sit in the corner quietly observing and occasionally say, "This kid will never learn." You usually just sat and watched your surroundings, taking in the people, sounds, smells, and realizing the transience of this moment. As November turned into December, life in Hawaii had settled into a routine, and you now knew your ship, your friends, your duty. Every morning you woke to the same whistle, ate the same breakfast, did the same work, and in the evenings lay down in the same bunk. This monotony was sometimes suffocating, but it also gave a sense of security, because you thought everything was under control, going as planned. No one talked about war, at least not openly. Of course, tensions with Japan were written about in newspapers, and commanders occasionally said, "Be alert." But these were distant, abstract things. Pearl Harbor was America's strongest base in the Pacific. There were 8 battleships here, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. No one would dare attack here. At least that's what you thought. Saturday evening, December 6th, you were on leave as usual, and you, Tommy, and Rodriguez had gone to Honolulu. That evening, sitting in a bar, Tommy was again talking about his girlfriend and asking, "What if war breaks out?" Rodriguez had shrugged and said, "War won't break out. We're on vacation here." And you had all laughed. You raised your beer glasses and toasted to peace. And none of you knew that the next morning would change your lives forever. When you returned to the ship late that night, you were tired, but happy because you had had a good evening. When you lay down in your bunk, Tommy was still talking, but you had fallen asleep without listening to him. Outside, the moon was illuminating Pearl Harbor, ships were swaying quietly in the water, and everything seemed peaceful. But across the ocean, thousands of kilometers away, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers were advancing toward Hawaii, and a fate you didn't know was approaching. Chapter 2. Morning of Destiny. Sunday morning, the reveille whistle didn't blow because Sundays on the ship were usually more relaxed, and soldiers had the luxury of waking up a bit later. You lay in your bunk, half awake, half asleep, listening to the seagull sounds from outside and that familiar sound of waves hitting and passing by the ship's side. The time was around 7 in the morning, and the sun was seeping through the ship's window with Hawaii's bright, warm light. Tommy was still snoring, and when you threw a pillow at him saying, "Shut that sound off," he grumbled and turned but didn't wake up. Rodriguez's bunk was empty because he had stayed on leave that night and slept at a friend's house in Honolulu. So, he must have returned early with worry about missing morning muster. When you finally straightened up from the bunk and stood up, your body still carried yesterday's fatigue, but since you had no special duty today, you thought you'd have a relaxing day. After washing your face, Johnson, whom you met in the corridor, said today breakfast service is at 8. You nodded in approval. Sunday mornings were always like this, the pace slow, everyone loose and relaxed. No one thinking about war or danger. When you went out on the ship's deck, the cool morning air hit your face, and when you looked at Pearl Harbor's calm waters, you noticed how peaceful everything looked. Military installations on Ford Island, giant warships lined up side by side in battleship row, seagulls flying here and there in the sky. This view reminded you of peace, security, and continuity. It was a little past 7 when Daniels, on duty in the ship's radio room, suddenly passed through the corridor with quick steps, and there was a slight expression of concern on his face. You asked him, "Is there a problem?" But he just said, "The radar team received strange signals, but they're probably our planes," and walked hurriedly toward the stern. You didn't pay much attention to this either, because such technical glitches occurred occasionally, and usually nothing came of it. What you didn't know was that at that moment, at the Opana radar station north of Oahu Island, 2 soldiers had detected a giant aircraft formation approaching from the north on their radars, and had reported it. However, the duty officer, thinking these signals probably belonged to American bomber aircraft expected from the mainland, had said, "Don't worry, those are our planes." This wrong assessment was a mistake that would change the course of history. But you were unaware of these at that moment. When you went to the breakfast hall, the tables in the hall weren't fully filled yet, because many soldiers were still sleeping, and some had stayed on leave last night. You put eggs, bread, and some ham on your plate, and sat at an empty table and started eating. Peters and Williams, sitting at the next table, were discussing weekend plans. Peters was planning to go to the cinema in the afternoon. Williams was thinking of swimming at the beach. You also wanted to maybe write a letter and spend time with your family, meaning to be close to them through the letter. When you finished breakfast, it was 35 past 7, and as you sipped your coffee, you looked out the window. Pearl Harbor's blue waters sparkled in the sun, and everything was so calm, it was as if time had stopped. After breakfast, you decided to go on deck and get some fresh air, because inside the ship could sometimes be airless and suffocating. There were a few more soldiers on deck. Some were smoking, some were sunbathing, some were preparing for the flag ceremony by the flagpole. Sunday mornings at 8 o'clock, a flag ceremony was always held and all personnel stood at attention. You also decided to stay on deck to watch, and started leaning against the railing and watching the ocean view. In the distance, beyond Ford Island, a few small boats were fishing, and you thought how carefree they looked. Maybe one day you too would retire and live such a quiet life. Maybe you would return home and be with your family. But now you were here, on duty, and that's what you had to do. Around 7:50, you heard an airplane sound in the sky, and when you raised your head and looked, you saw several approaching planes from far away. Your first thought was that these were morning patrol planes, because every morning some planes flew patrol around the island. However, the number of planes was large, and their formations looked strange. Miller next to you also looked at the planes and asked, "Is there a drill today?" And you said you didn't know. The planes were getting closer, and now you could hear their engines roar more clearly. For a moment you thought you saw a red mark on one of the plane's wings, but because the sun dazzled your eyes, you couldn't be sure. When it reached 7:55, the planes had come over Pearl Harbor and were starting to descend. You still thought this was a drill, because what else could it be? But a few seconds later, you saw something fall from under one of the planes, and it flashed in the air. When the first bomb hit the aircraft hangar on Ford Island, a tremendous explosion sound shook the ship's deck, and you looked in shock at the giant smoke cloud rising from where the explosion occurred. Miller shouted, "What the hell is this?" And you couldn't answer because your mind couldn't comprehend it. A second later came the second, third, fourth explosions, and the sky suddenly filled with dozens of planes. Now you could see clearly. The planes' wings had huge red sun marks. These were Japanese planes. At that moment, chaos began on the ship because whistles started blowing everywhere. Soldiers started running, and commanders started shouting. You were still in shock, and your legs wouldn't move as if nailed in place, but someone shouting, "Run to ammunition," brought you to your senses. You started running, and the corridors filled with soldiers flooding in panic. Everyone was running in different directions at the same time, some looking for weapons, some looking for life vests, some just running without knowing what to do. When you reached the ammunition depot, you saw the door was locked, and you had to wait because the officer with the key hadn't arrived yet. This wait was seconds but felt like hours to you, because explosions continued outside the ship, and each explosion shook the ship's hull. The sounds you heard outside weren't just explosion sounds anymore. Airplane engines were passing low, machine gun fire was rattling, and people were screaming. You saw the smoke rising from USS Maryland next to the ship, through the corridor window, and felt your heart beating fast. This was real. This wasn't a drill. This was war. The Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor, and you were right in the middle. When the officer finally came and opened the ammunition depot, you rushed inside and started taking shell boxes, but your hands were trembling. Everything was happening so fast your brain couldn't follow events. 10 minutes ago, you were having breakfast and planning your Sunday. Now, you were in the middle of a life-or-death battle while carrying shells to the deck. The scene you saw on deck was a nightmare because everywhere was impassable, with smoke, fire, and blood. When planes passed low and raked the deck with machine guns, soldiers fell to the ground, and some never got up again. You dropped the shells and immediately lay on the ground and heard the whistle of bullets passing over you. When you raised your head and looked, the sky was full of planes. Some were dropping torpedoes, some were dropping bombs, some were just firing with machine guns. Ships in Battleship Row were being hit one by one, and flames rising from some were darkening the sky. While you were still lying on the ground, Johnson next to you asked, "Are we sinking?" And you said, "I don't know," because you really didn't know. No one knew what condition the ship was in, how much damage it had taken, how much time you had. All you knew was you were in the middle of something terrible and trying to survive. Chapter 3. The Gates of Hell Open. When you went out on deck, the first thing you saw was Japanese torpedo planes flying low over Battleship Row, and the red sun marks on their wings now appeared clear enough to leave no doubt. The planes were so low you could see the pilots' faces, and this reality deeply shook you because the enemy was no longer an abstract concept, but real people flying in the sky, dropping bombs, killing. When the first torpedo hit USS West Virginia, a giant water column rose from the ship's side, and the explosion sound that followed deafened your ears. You saw soldiers running on West Virginia's deck, and their panic was no different from yours, because no one was prepared for such a morning. While the ship's alarm system continued ringing frantically, you and your friends were trying to carry ammunition boxes to anti-aircraft batteries. But everything was so chaotic that finding where things were was even difficult. Soldiers colliding with each other in corridors, falling materials, breaking glass, and smoke rising from everywhere had turned the ship's interior into a labyrinth. When you saw Tommy in the corridor, his face was covered in sweat and panic. And when he asked you, "Is this real? Is this really happening?" you just nodded because you couldn't find words to speak. It was really happening. The Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor, and you were trying to survive on USS Oklahoma's deck. It was past 8 when the first torpedo explosion was felt on the ship's side, and this impact was so violent it threw you 1 meter into the air. When you fell to the ground, your knees hurt, but you didn't even have time to feel pain because the second torpedo came, then the third, then the fourth. A total of 9 torpedoes hit USS Oklahoma, and each one opened giant holes in the ship's side, causing tons of water to pour inside. When you felt the ship starting to list, your first thought was, "It can't be this fast," but the ship's deck was tilting visibly. Warships sank slowly, didn't they? It would take hours. People would be evacuated. Lifeboats would be prepared. But Oklahoma wasn't doing that. It was listing and doing it very fast. Everyone on deck was shouting, running, and looking for a place to escape, because everyone now felt the ship listing to port. You also started running, but you didn't know where to run, because every part of the ship was in chaos. Some soldiers were trying to jump into the sea. Some were trying to save friends trapped inside the ship. Some were just holding on to something, waiting for the ship to sink. When you held onto a pole, the ship's listing angle was increasing, and now standing on deck had become almost impossible. Everything was sliding, falling, and rolling into the water. The ship's giant cannons, materials, people, all were sliding together toward port. When you looked at USS Arizona, you saw its situation was even worse, because Arizona's deck was burning in flames, and the water around the ship was full of oil and debris. It was 10 past 8 when Arizona received the most deadly blow. A Japanese bomber dropped a bomb right in the middle of the ship, on top of the ammunition depot. The bomb pierced the deck and went inside, and when it reached the ammunition depot, the resulting explosion was so tremendous it was heard throughout Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, a giant fireball rose into the sky, and the shockwave that followed even shook USS Oklahoma's deck where you were. Arizona's middle had split in two. The ship's forward section had flown into the air and then crashed back into the water. There were 1,170 sailors on that ship, and most had died instantly in that explosion. As you watched Arizona's explosion, your eyes filled because there were people you knew there, people you had coffee with, joked with, dreamed with, and now they were all gone. But you didn't have time to mourn because your own ship was sinking. Oklahoma had now almost completely listed, and standing on deck was impossible. Everyone was either jumping into the sea or being trapped under the ship. You had to decide too. You would either stay on the ship and risk being trapped underneath, or jump into the ice-cold, oil-filled, death-filled water. When you looked at the people around you, you saw some had already jumped, and you took a deep breath. When you jumped into the sea, the water's coldness enveloped your entire body and took your breath away, but you started swimming because you had to get away from the ship. USS Oklahoma had completely listed and was starting to show its belly, which meant hundreds of people trapped under the ship were stuck. As you swam, you saw the oil on the water's surface, and this oil catching fire was a matter of moments. You tried not to look at the debris pieces floating around, lifeless bodies, screaming wounded, but everywhere was full of these. At one point, you saw Miller swimming past you and noticed blood flowing from his arm, but he was still swimming. "Swim toward Ford Island," he shouted to you, and you started swimming toward him. Japanese planes were still circling in the sky, and some were even firing at soldiers who had jumped into the sea because targets were everything for them. You saw places in the water where machine gun bullets hit and tried to dive and hide each time. When you raised your head above water to breathe, you saw the sky had been covered with black smoke because now almost all ships were burning. USS Nevada was trying to leave the harbor in flames. USS California was slowly sinking. USS Tennessee was stuck with its neighbor ship. Battleship Roe had truly turned into hell. As you continued swimming toward Ford Island, you looked back one last time at USS Oklahoma and saw the ship had completely capsized. That giant warship was now standing on the water, showing its belly, and underneath it hundreds of soldiers were still trapped, hitting the ship's metal hull, waiting to be rescued. You couldn't hear them, but you could imagine those waiting helplessly in the dark, in narrow compartments where water was rising while oxygen was decreasing. Some of those people would be rescued in the following days, but most would bid farewell to life there, inside that cold metal coffin. When you reached shore, your body was exhausted, breathing rapid, and your eyes were burning because oily water had gotten in your eyes. When you threw yourself on the sand, you just lay there for a while and tried to breathe. Around you were hundreds more people. Some were wounded, some were dead, some were in shock like you. A nurse came to you and asked, "Are you wounded?" And you shook your head and said, "No, just wet." But in reality, how would you know if you were okay? Maybe you were wounded, but couldn't feel it because of shock. It was past 8:40 when a new wave of aircraft appeared in the sky, and this was the second attack wave. While the first wave had focused on torpedo and bomb attacks, the second wave was targeting more aircraft hangars, airfields, and remaining ships. As you sat on shore, you watched the sky and saw American anti-aircraft batteries finally starting to fire. It was a delayed response, but at least it was a response. Some Japanese planes were shot down and fell into the sea. Some were completing their missions and returning. This was war. The killed and the killer, the hit and the hitter, the loser and the winner. Military doctors on shore were trying to treat the wounded, but their numbers were too many. Everywhere there was blood, pain, screaming. Some wounded had arms torn off, some were burned, some were just torn apart. You also wanted to help and went to the doctors and asked, "What can I do?" A doctor gave you bandages and said, "Try to stop the bleeding," and you started doing what you could. The wounded next to you was Tommy, and blood was gushing from his leg. His eyes looked at you and asked, "Am I going to die?" You told him, "No, you won't die, we'll save you." But your voice wasn't convincing, because Tommy's blood loss was too much. You tightly wrapped the bandages around his leg and applied pressure, but the blood wouldn't stop. Tommy's hand tightly grasped yours and said, "Tell my mother. Tell her I loved her." You said, "You'll tell her yourself when you get home." But Tommy smiled, and his eyes slowly closed. Around 9 o'clock, the attack started slowing down, and Japanese planes started returning. The sky was still full of smoke, but explosion sounds had now decreased. When you looked around, Pearl Harbor's condition was a complete disaster. 8 battleships sunk or seriously damaged, hundreds of planes destroyed, thousands of people dead or wounded. Just an hour ago, it was a peaceful Sunday morning. Now you were in the middle of one of history's greatest military attacks. You were still sitting on shore, with bandages covered in Tommy's blood in your hands and scenes in your eyes you didn't want to see. War had come. and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 4: The Struggle for Survival. When you released Tommy's hand, your fingers were still wet with his blood, and this warmth reminded you how fragile life was. Around you were hundreds more wounded, and all were waiting for help because the number of doctors was insufficient. Medical supplies were running out, and time was more valuable than anything. For a moment, you wanted to sit there and cry, but you didn't have time to cry because another wounded person next to you was moaning, and he needed help too. When you stood up, your legs were trembling, but you continued walking and went toward the next wounded person. He was a Marine and had been shot in the chest, breathing rapid and lips turning blue. When you pressed the bandages to his chest, he looked at you and said, "My family. Notify my family." You told him, "We will. Don't worry." But he too, like Tommy, slowly closed his eyes and stopped breathing. While working on shore around 9 o'clock, pounding sounds suddenly started coming from inside one of the ships, and these sounds came from soldiers still trapped inside USS Oklahoma. The ship had capsized, and hundreds of soldiers trapped underneath were stuck in dark, airtight compartments, hitting metal walls calling for help. Some soldiers on shore immediately jumped into boats and started rowing toward the ship, and you wanted to join them because your friends might be there too. You hadn't seen Rodriguez since morning, and maybe he was inside the ship, maybe waiting for help in the darkness. When you jumped into one of the boats, there were 4 more soldiers with you, and you all started rowing toward Oklahoma. As you approached the ship, you saw its enormous hull standing above water, and this sight was surreal because a warship shouldn't stand like this. When you climbed onto the ship's belly, the metal surface was slippery and full of oil, but you found places to hold and climbed up. The pounding sounds from inside the ship were now heard more clearly, and from some places, weak voices came. "Help. We're here. Get us out." The voices were desperate, hopeless, and each one squeezed your heart. One soldier in the team had brought a metal cutting tool, and you started trying to open a compartment in the ship's belly. But the work was difficult, because the metal was thick and the tool worked slowly. Every second was valuable because the air inside the ship was decreasing, and the water level was rising. When you finally opened the first hole, a hand reached out from inside, and you grabbed it and pulled up. The soldier who came out was covered head to toe in oil and blood, eyes swollen and breathing difficult, but he was alive. "Thank you, thank you," he kept repeating, and you put him in the boat. Then the second, third, fourth soldiers came out. Some were wounded, some were just in shock, but all were alive. However, there were still hundreds more people inside the ship, and getting them all out was impossible. At one point you hoped to hear Rodriguez's voice, but that voice didn't come, and maybe he was in the deeper compartments of the ship. Maybe it was already too late. Rescue operations continued for hours, and you were tired. But you couldn't stop because each rescued person was a hope. Each opened hole was a chance. Toward noon, reaching some compartments of the ship became impossible because water had filled inside, and for the rest, there was nothing left to do. When you returned to the boat, the metal cutting tool in your hand was bloody, and your fingers were swollen from blisters. When you returned to shore, the scene had changed, because now wounded were being transported to hospitals. Debris pieces were being collected, and bodies were being lined up. Bodies were lined up in a long row on shore, and each was covered with a blanket or cloth. As you passed by that line, you were afraid of seeing familiar faces, but you had to look because you were still looking for Rodriguez. When you stopped by a body in the middle of the line, a nurse lifting the cover was trying to identify him. You told her, "I'll look." And when you lifted the cover, the face you saw was Rodriguez's. His eyes were closed, and there was a peaceful expression on his face, as if he was just sleeping. But he wasn't sleeping. He was dead and would never wake up. When you collapsed to your knees, tears ran down your cheeks. Because Rodriguez wasn't just a friend. He was like your brother. You had worked together on the ship, gone to Honolulu together, dreamed together. He would return home and go to his family, live on the ranch in Texas, and make music. But now he was here, cold, motionless, and silent. The nurse touched your shoulder and asked, "Do you know him?" And you nodded and said, "Yes, he was my friend." The nurse took out a paper and said, "Can you tell me his name?" And you told Rodriguez's full name, rank, and ship. As she wrote on the paper, you looked at Rodriguez one last time and whispered, "Goodbye, friend. Rest in peace." Around 10 o'clock, one of the commanders gathered all able soldiers and said, "We're still at war. Another attack could come. Be ready." Indeed, no one was sure the Japanese wouldn't send a second wave, and Pearl Harbor was in a defenseless state because most ships had been destroyed. Planes were ruined and soldiers were scattered. You were given a rifle and asked to stand guard on Ford Island's shore. When you started watching the sky, every sound, every shadow kept you alert because you didn't want to be attacked again. But if necessary, you were ready to fight. Throughout the afternoon, rescue operations continued, and some military units were still trying to extinguish fires by spraying water on still-burning ships. USS Arizona was still burning, and flames were rising to the sky because the fuel in the ship constantly fed the fire. USS California continued slowly sinking, and soldiers inside were trying to salvage materials from the ship until the last moment. USS Nevada had run aground and its deck was damaged, but at least it hadn't completely sunk. As you watched all this, you saw what had become of America's Pacific Fleet. A few hours ago, this fleet was one of the world's most powerful naval forces. Now it had become a pile of wreckage. Toward evening, you finally took a break, and you were given a piece of bread and water. The bread was stale, but you still ate it, because you hadn't eaten anything since morning, and your stomach was cramping. Williams, sitting next to you. Williams, who had been planning to go to the cinema at breakfast, was now sitting with his arm bandaged and his face covered with burn marks. He looked at you and asked, "Do you think war has started?" You told him, "Yes, war has started, because nothing could be more certain than this. The Japanese had attacked. Thousands of Americans had died, and America would answer for this." When the sun set, as you looked at Pearl Harbor, the sky was still full of smoke, and flames were still rising from some ships. There was an oil layer on the water's surface, and debris pieces were scattered everywhere. On shore, bodies were now more orderly lined up, and an identification tag was placed next to each one. Wounded had been transported to hospitals, and those remaining were either standing guard or helping with debris cleanup. When you returned to your guard post, you noticed your surroundings were dark because there was a power outage, and only firelight from some ships illuminated the area. Throughout the night you couldn't sleep because every sound startled you, and every shadow looked like an enemy plane. Some soldiers really thought Japanese paratroopers would land on the island and were preparing accordingly. However, nothing happened throughout the night, and when morning came, you were still alive. Monday morning, December 8th. Pearl Harbor was silent. But this wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of death. When you looked around, you saw what remained of yesterday's chaos. Broken ships, burned wreckage, blood-stained decks, and soldiers looking with empty eyes. At morning muster, the commander gathered all soldiers and said, "Yesterday, America was attacked, but America was not defeated. Our losses are many, but our spirit is strong. Now our job is to punish the enemy." Then the casualty numbers that had been uncertain until that day were announced, and the figures were incredible. More than 2,400 people had died, More than 1,170 had been wounded. 8 battleships sunk or seriously damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers damaged. More than 200 planes destroyed. On USS Arizona alone, 1,177 sailors had lost their lives. These weren't just numbers. They were people, your friends, acquaintances, brothers. After muster, you sat on shore and looked at the ocean and saw the waves still hitting the shore in the same way. Nature didn't care about what happened at Pearl Harbor. The sun had risen again. Birds were still flying. Life was continuing. But your life was no longer the same. Because yesterday morning you were an ordinary soldier. Today, you were a war veteran. In your hands was still the blood of friends you tried to save. In your eyes were still scenes you didn't want to see. And in your heart were still pains you didn't want to carry. But you would carry them because you had no other choice. War had begun, and you were part of it. Chapter 5. Nothing will ever be the same. When the first light of December 8th morning illuminated Pearl Harbor, you were still at the guard post on shore, and while your eyes burned from sleeplessness, you scanned the sky because the fear that the Japanese might come again wouldn't leave your mind. You hadn't slept all night, and every sound had kept you alert, but now it was morning and the enemy hadn't returned. When you looked around, Pearl Harbor's appearance in daylight was even more tragic, because details hidden in darkness were now visible to the naked eye. USS Arizona's remains still stood above water, and oil was still leaking from the ship's sunken hull, this oil forming a rainbow-colored layer covering the water's surface. This scene would remain like this for years to come, because Arizona's internal fuel tanks would leak oil into the ocean for decades, and mark this ship's grave. At 8 in the morning, the commander gathered all soldiers, and new duties were assigned because defending Pearl Harbor, treating the wounded, and cleaning up debris required organized effort. The duty given to you and a few soldiers was to extract still salvageable materials from sunken ships and collect usable weapons. This meant you would go to sunken ships again, dive into those death-smelling, oil-filled waters, and work among debris. You thought inside that you didn't want to do this work, but you had no other choice, because every weapon, every bullet, every material was important, and America needed them. Toward noon, sitting with a group of soldiers on shore, someone brought a radio, and the voices from the radio silenced everyone because President Franklin D. Roosevelt would speak. You gathered around the radio, and among the static sounds, Roosevelt's familiar, powerful voice rose. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Each of Roosevelt's words was clear and determined, and as you listened, you felt something swelling in your chest. He wasn't just describing an attack. He was expressing a nation's anger, pain, and determination. As an American people, we love peace, but when provoked, victory is inevitable, he said. And these sentences gave you strength because you were no longer alone. All of America was with you. When Roosevelt's speech ended, news came that Congress had approved the declaration of war, and this meant America was officially at war. Soldiers around the radio were silent, but something had changed in their eyes, because yesterday's shock had turned into anger and determination. Today, Williams looked at you and said, "Now we'll show them." And you nodded, because he was right. Those who died at Pearl Harbor hadn't died in vain. They were a reason for America to wake up. And now, America was waking. In the afternoon, you were given another duty, and this time it was to go to the hospital and help the wounded. Because hospitals were still packed, and doctors were exhausted from fatigue. When you went to the hospital, you saw wounded lying in the corridors, and some weren't even on beds. They were just waiting on a blanket on the floor. When you entered, a nurse told you, distribute water, talk, give morale, and you started walking among the wounded with the water canteen in your hand. Some wanted water, some just wanted to talk, and some were just looking at the ceiling silently. When you stopped by a wounded person, he looked at you and asked, "Did my ship sink?" You asked him which ship he was on, and he said, "Oklahoma." You didn't dare tell him the truth, so you said, "I don't know." But he smiled and said, "Don't lie. I saw it. It capsized." You spent hours in the hospital, and each wounded person had a story. Some had been wounded in bomb explosions. Some had just luckily survived. A young soldier told you he wanted to write a letter to his family, but because his hands were bandaged, he couldn't write. You told him, "I'll write. Tell me what you'll say," and he started dictating. "Dear Mother, I'm fine. Don't worry. Something happened at Pearl Harbor, but I'm alive. I missed you very much. I'll come home soon. I love you. Your son, James." As you wrote, you noticed your hands trembling, because that boy was telling his mother lies. He wasn't fine. His leg had been amputated. He wouldn't come home soon. Maybe he'd stay in the hospital for months, maybe years. But you still wrote because he wanted to give his mother hope, and you had to give him that right. When evening came, you finally took a break and wanted to go outside and get fresh air. When you left the hospital, the sky was painted in crimson colors, and the sun was setting behind Pearl Harbor. This scene was beautiful, but you could no longer see beauty, because every time you looked, you saw burned ships, broken masts, and smoke clouds. When you sat on a bench, a chaplain who came to you asked, "Are you okay, son?" You told him, "I don't know," because you really didn't know. Your body was tired, your mind confused, and your heart heavy. The chaplain sat next to you and said, "Do you want to talk?" And you told him everything. Rodriguez, Tommy, the sunken ships, the screams, the blood, the pain. The chaplain listened to you and then said, "God has a plan, and sometimes we don't understand this plan, but we must trust." You asked him, "Did God's plan include 1,177 men burning on Arizona?" And your voice was harsh. The chaplain was silent, and then said, "I don't know. But those who died are no longer suffering. They're at peace. Our duty is to continue living and preserve their memory." These words didn't comfort you, but at least you felt the relief of having talked. As the chaplain laughed, he said, "Take care of yourself, son. The war is just beginning." And you nodded. At night, when you returned to your bed, you lay down in your bunk in the barracks, and for the first time had a chance to think about what had happened in the last 2 days. 2 days ago, you were a soldier vacationing in Hawaii, serving in peacetime. Now you were a veteran who had seen war, seen death, lost friends. The world had changed, and you had changed with it. You were no longer innocent as before. You now knew how fragile life was, and you now understood what war meant. When you tried to sleep, every time you closed your eyes, you saw Arizona's explosion, Oklahoma's listing, Rodriguez's face. The following days passed with debris cleanup, rescue operations, and reconstruction, because there was no time for Pearl Harbor to just sit and cry. There was work to be done. Soldiers were still being extracted from sunken ships, and some had miraculously survived. There were soldiers trapped inside USS Oklahoma for 15 days, and when they were rescued, hearing their stories was incredible. They had fought in the dark, in narrow compartments, with decreasing air, and had hit metal walls with hope of survival. You also worked on rescue teams, and each rescued person was a victory. Each found body was a closure. Days turned into weeks, and Pearl Harbor slowly began returning to normal. But nothing was truly normal anymore because war was everywhere. War news was constantly given on radios. Newspapers were filled with victory slogans against Japan, and Remember Pearl Harbor posters were hung on every corner. This slogan wasn't just a reminder. It was a vow, a promise, a determination. America would never forget Pearl Harbor, and Japan would pay dearly for this attack. In January, you finally had a chance to write a letter to your family, and as you thought about what to write on paper, the pen just stood still in your hand. What could you tell them? What you experienced at Pearl Harbor? That Rodriguez died? That Tommy died in your arms? No, you couldn't say these because you didn't want to worry them. Finally, you just wrote a short and simple letter. Dear family, I'm fine. My health is good. Some things happened at Pearl Harbor, but I'm alive. Don't worry, I'll write again soon. I love you all very much. When you put the letter in the envelope, you thought inside, I wish I could tell the truth. But some truths were too heavy to tell. In February, you received new duty orders, and you would be sent to another island in the Pacific because the war hadn't ended at Pearl Harbor. It had just begun. As you packed your belongings, you looked at Pearl Harbor one last time and saw the part of USS Arizona remaining above water. That ship had now become a monument, was the grave of 1,170 sailors, and would remain there forever. One day when you died, there would perhaps be people who would visit Arizona, and when they looked at that ship, they wouldn't just see wreckage, they would see the symbol of a tragedy, a sacrifice, and a nation's awakening. Before boarding the ship, you went to the cemetery and stood at Rodriguez's grave. On the gravestone were only his name, rank, and date of death. Died with honor at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. You knelt and said, friend, the war continues, and I'll fight for you too. You rest in peace. I'll go back and settle the score. You left a flower on the grave and saluted one last time. As the ship left Pearl Harbor, you stood on deck looking back. As the island moved away, it became smaller and slowly disappeared on the horizon. Pearl Harbor was now left behind, but it would live forever in your memory, because that morning, that December 7th, 1941 morning, you weren't just a soldier, you were a witness to history. You would never forget what you learned that day. How merciless war was. How valuable life was. How important friendship was. And every December 7th, until the end of your life, you would remember that morning and say, remember Pearl Harbor, because some moments are lived not to be forgotten, but to be remembered. The ship's whistle blew, and you looked at Pearl Harbor one last time. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted crimson, just like that morning when Arizona exploded. But this time there were no flames, just a peaceful sunset. Maybe this was a sign, maybe Pearl Harbor would find peace again one day. You thought inside, one day this war will end, and I'll return home. But now was the time for war, and you would fight for America, for those who died at Pearl Harbor, for Rodriguez, for Tommy. The ship sailed into the ocean, and Pearl Harbor remained behind you, but never left your heart.